I was a turnaround expert. I was hired to turn around the worst performing schools in the District of Columbia, and I did it. I was successful until they ran me out of town for being a white guy. Now,
Oh
uh,
wow.
on our board at one of our schools, we had this older gentleman, and the rest of the board members sort of tolerated him, but he would go on these rants, but they were educated rants. He was so right. He would say, "Look, he was not that it really matters, but he was African American and he was an engineer." And so he just kept saying over and over again, this is a systems problem. This is a systems problem. When he's talking about behavioral issues in the school, when he's talking about reading and math scores within the school, when he's talking about any issue going on in the school, he's like, this is a systems problem. And that is, to me, where I began to really zoom out and try to understand how it was that there were people in this community that we were serving where there was a single mom with multiple children from multiple different dads, unmarried, on benefit. We were 99% free and reduced lunch, probably 100%. And I mean, so this is like the deepest, not darkest, the most stricken neighborhoods of Washington, D.C. And I saw firsthand the incentive structure at play that you're describing, where it disincentivizes marriage, it incentivizes having children without a dad, and you end up then with a mom who's overwhelmed and unable to effectively parent, much less improve her own life, much less continue on with advanced education, continuing education, professional development, etc. And it made me wonder, and I've been asking this question in so many different circumstances, is this a failure of ignorance in terms of the policy making, or is it a deliberate destruction of a community? Do the Democrats want Black folks in the city to be single parents struggling and on the dole, unable to rise up and to do the American thing of changing your station? Or is it just an accident because they want to help? What do you think? Is it dumb or diabolical?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I think it's probably a combination of both. I think if someone is a statist and they believe that the government is going to solve all your problems, as many leftists do, then it is to their advantage to have as many people on benefits as possible, because now you have more people that need you to live. So you're expanding the footprint of the government and people's dependence on the government. So yeah, I do think in that sense there is a certain deliberateness to this. But I think on a large scale, when when we look at why haven't we been able to change this, even when Republicans have the majority, there's very little action on entitlement reform, on welfare reform, recently at least, post 2000. I think one reason is because a lot of people simply assume, if you're giving out money to help the poor people, that means you're helping them. It's a very simple belief that people have, which is not true at all. And so people have a hard time fathoming how this really works. And then when you say maybe we shouldn't actually be paying, a single parent to have more kids without the father, for example, people think you're being mean. And so it's not true. You're actually helping the system. As you said, it's a systems problem. I like that a lot. That's a really accurate way of describing it. But people don't necessarily think that way. They take it kind of a one-dimensional on the surface. How could you take money away from this person? Are you mean? Do you hate? Are you saying you're better than someone? People go through that thought process. So there hasn't been good messaging and good strategy, I think, from, I don't mean you and me, but generally people on our side, to counter this and say, look, if you really love people, if you really care about people, if you care about children, you want children to be raised in the best environment. That's what you do if you love kids. Therefore, then you'll look at what the science and the common sense and Christianity and Judaism, every good religion tells us that you need two parents at home. This is just common sense. What used to be common sense, and I think that message has got to get out there. We need strong families, but it's not getting there. So the politicians are not having the courage to step up and do it. So they're leaving these programs the same. I think it's going to take guts, and I think we're getting there. I mean, if we see a wave in 22, we may have some folks who are able to stand up and say, look, we're not going to tolerate the destruction of children and families anymore. Thomas Sowell used to always say, slavery, the Civil War, segregation, Jim Crow did not destroy the black family, but the welfare state did. And I think that's a very good thing to keep in mind as we see this madness going on. But another data point, I like to look at like the data over time, especially. You look at the black home ownership rate, it had its fastest increase from 1880 to 1930. There's no HUD, there's no welfare state, no government programs. It was regular people in families and communities building their own houses. Back then, you could even order a house from a Sears catalog.
Yeah.
But they didn't have regulatory red tape and all the stuff that we have today. You could easily build your own house. And the home ownership rate increased by about 3 to 4-fold over that period, whereas it's never increased that fast since then, even with all the spending, 22, 23 trillion in so-called anti-poverty spending since the 60s. You've never seen results like that. So I think we really have got to dispense with this idea that more spending is how you help the poor and the vulnerable. And it's going to take a huge effort. I think we need to get every conservative filmmaker and marketing person together and have a big powwow and lock themselves in the room and with pizza and no one comes out. And so we figure out how do you message this to people psychologically and get it out there that, you know, we love people. And if you love people, we're not just throwing money at them. We want to actually get people up and out. So I think it's going to take something like that. Then once the public awareness and the pitchforks come out, the politicians are going to have to know they got to change this thing or they're not going to get elected. So yeah, I think that's what it would take.
You mentioned the Sears houses where I used to live in Washington, D.C. in the Palisades area. It's all of them. There's so many of these Sears catalog houses. Really fascinating to think about it. It's not quite the same. Man, so many issues there. I want to talk. You talked about the rate of black home ownership and the way that it increased and then sort of stopped. I've seen the same evidence in closing the achievement gap as well. There was a big closure and then the closing stopped, coinciding with actually focusing on the achievement gap and throwing all this money at it and making it the issue. That seemed to be correlate, slightly with when the gap stopped closing. And, as somebody who was involved in real estate and fixed income around 2006, 7, 8, and 9, I very, very vividly lived the housing experience the housing crisis experience from all levels. I understand the mortgage-backed security market from my hedge fund private equity days, so I knew what was going on there, the craziness there. And then I was also building, delivering, and selling housing units in the city at the same time. So I saw people coming to the closing table with 0% down, first trust, second trust, a third trust, going over 100% LTV, actually walking away from the table with cash, with no income and no assets. And in my mind, this was the most extreme credit expansion you've ever seen. And yet today people will tell us, and this ended up being the source of the housing crisis, right? And the separation between the lender's risk and the default risk. That was a big deal. But people will say today that access to credit and access to the ability to purchase homes is the limiting systemic racism factor that is keeping people from actually achieving home ownership. What do you say to people like that when I feel like we've already lived through like that trial and it didn't quite work out? What do you say to people in terms of credit access and such, and the systemic racism argument around there?
I love science, but I mean real science, not what certain people claim is science. I mean like real studies. And the data shows that argument is simply false, that access to credit is number one barrier. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Ed Pinto over at AEI. He's a housing researcher. He does spectacular work on this. He goes through all the numbers and crunches them, and he actually has shown over the past several months that this argument that access to credit is the culprit here is not true. When you adjust for credit scores and socioeconomic background, there actually is not really a gap between black and white, for example, and access to mortgages. So what you really have to look at is why are the credit scores lower for some groups? And this goes back to, again, the very same thing that we see coming up over and over again. You got to get to the heart of the person, the mind of the person, and you got to deal with things like delayed gratification, savings, the nature of interest. What happens to $1 if you put it in today and you've got an interest rate, and where's that in a year and 2 years? Do you want to buy your expensive shoes, or do you want to put that money in and see where it goes in a CD, or put it in a index fund, or that kind of thing. That knowledge of this investment, delayed gratification, and time value of money, you've got to get that just soaked in and marinated with disadvantaged populations. That's going to be the key to this. And that's how you're going to see people get their credit scores up, understand money better. And then that's going to get people where they can pay their mortgage on time because they've had that built into them once we get those things ingrained in the population. But, the reason I think you don't see a lot of action there is it takes time and it's hard. There's no simple government program you can sign off on that will get this solved within 2 years of a congressional election cycle. This is something that takes a while, and I'm okay with that. I think all real solutions to these difficult problems will take time, but because of the nature of political cycles and how short they are, a lot of the politicians don't want to take a stab at something that is going to take a long time or longer than their election cycles to solve. So, yeah, I mean, the real way to do this is just the same as everything else: is get to the heart of the matter, love folks, and get people to understand what money means and savings and investment. Then you get the scores up, and then you reduce the disparity. Another thing here is married couples compared to single couples have something like twice the rate of home ownership. And because of the dramatic increase in unwed mothers among the Black population, the percentage of Black people who are married has just dropped since the 60s. And it's because people that are married are more likely to own homes. That therefore means the percentage of people that own homes has also dropped. So I think that the majority, not the entirety, but the majority of this problem can simply be attributed to the dramatic decline in marriage among the Black population. And the politicians often don't want to talk about this. They don't want to look at that because, again, it's a little bit of a harder problem. We can crack it. We know what it would take. You got to have the economic incentives in place for marriage, but that is something that a lot of them don't want to talk about. So they want to do surface solutions, band-aid solutions. You have this critical race theory type racism is what it is, to be very blunt about it, that is popping up. And now they're trying to apply that explanation to the mortgages and housing, saying, oh, we can just explain this with one word: racism. That's all it takes. And yeah, that's why we're seeing all these problems. It's not scientific. It's almost a conspiracy theory in a certain manner of the word, because it's not based on real research and randomized controlled trials and actual real science. It's an unproven and unprovable explanation for any problem that they want to apply it to. But if we look at the real data, I think we know what it takes to uplift folks, and it's how folks view money, how folks use money. That's where it's at.